Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to take a brief look at the evolution of the English language. And the answer to where does English come from is actually pretty complicated because, like most other languages, it's not invented by one person in one place and one time sits down and says, this is the language, this is exactly the rules we're going to use, this is the way we're all going to speak it. Instead, language evolves, it changes. If you think of it like a river that goes through and then gets changed by the things that it encounters, wanders off, sometimes some branches and some tributaries kind of die out and others continue on. But it is always meandering and sometimes recombining into something new. So like most things that we're going to study connected with humanity, we really begin our look at Africa. So as humans flowed out of Africa and started to leave those original foundations, they carried their language with them. The population grew, groups separated, some migrated off to various places, and the language also went with them and then changed and divided. Some of the very earliest languages, what we call the primeval languages, were only spoken, so there's no bones or artifacts or recordings of what these languages might have looked like or sounded like. So there's this huge gap in our knowledge where we know that people must have been communicating with each other, but we actually have no record of what that might have looked or sounded like. So the very first languages are lost, but what we trace everything back to is something that the researchers have labeled Proto-Indo-European. So Proto-IE for short, we're looking at something from about 6,000 years ago. And we know that it probably started around the border of Turkey in what's called the Caucasian Mountains. If you ever heard people with light skin refer to as Caucasian, they're talking about that boundary that separated the folks coming out of Africa and then crossing over into the area in Turkey. And then farmers who probably spoke the ancestral language were tilling their way through better and better pastures and making their way gradually north and west into Europe. And some of these groups wandered even still farther and settled in what today would be southern Scandinavia and northern Germany. And this brings us to what we know now today is Proto-Germanic. So now we're going up to about 1000 BC, and these languages had evolved into from these Germanic tribes. Now, some of these Germanic tribes stayed north in Scandinavia and northern Germany, but others continued to go east and to west. And we see the Proto-Germanic language evolving into 11 distinct categories. So these folks who were furthest in the north, they gradually changed the language into something we would recognize today as Icelandic, Faroese, which we'll talk about, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish. But the groups that moved more to the east were developing their own separate dialects and became languages that are identified as Vandal, Gothic, and Burgundian. Now, none of those exist here still today, although there's forms and pieces of them that you can find in contemporary languages. Now, the tribes that came west also split up and developed this Proto-Germanic language into the things that we would recognize today as German, Dutch, and Frisian. And one of these languages, Frisian, is going to be our parent language that we're following into English. So these tribes were following the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. They're living on the coastland in West Germany and Denmark, and they're speaking various dialects of Frisian. And this is the group that sailed west over to this island of England. And originally they came over both to trade and to raid. Now think of your Vikings sort of coming over and taking and stealing sheep and bringing them back. And England was really easy pickings at about this point in history because the Romans had just picked up and left. So there was very little organized authority going on in the land. So it was very easy for a tribe to come over, either trade or get what they wanted, and then go back to their homeland. Eventually, this group recognized that, hey, you know, England actually looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and just move in and set up our own settlements here. So this migration from what is now West Germany and Denmark really began around the mid-5th century. And some of these people may originally even have been hired to protect the Celtic people of Britain from these northern Scots and the turmoil that resulted from the collapse of Rome, but eventually they settled in this area as well. And right about this time, we see what we consider to be Old English is born. These are these Germanic tribes that have now settled in England, and after, the 5th century or so, the language of these invaders kind of mixed up and mushed and smushed into the folks who were there in the first place and created the English language that what researchers today refer to as Old English, and was also referred to as Anglo-Saxon after the tribes of the Angles and the tribes of the Saxons who spoke it. Now, Old English, if you see it written or hear it spoken, actually looks and sounds a lot like German, and some of the letters and things even look strange to us as a modern English speaker. And that brings us up to what philologists, or people who study the evolution of languages and the connections between languages, refer to as Old English, and that's the first format of what we think of as the English language. Now, some of these Anglo-Saxon influences are still very strong on modern speech, and lots of words that we commonly use, some of the most commonly used words in modern English, come out of this original Anglo-Saxon tradition. And we're going to be looking at some of those in a mini project in class over the next couple of days. And that's the end.